Bumblebee viewers, welcome back once again. Today's video is on the top 10 disturbing things done by pharaohs in Egypt. Disturbing decision number 10 is getting lit. Whether their decisions were in regards to themselves, their offspring, their futures, their laws, or their people, pharaohs weren't always known for making the most rational or sane choices. But some things they felt were completely in the hands of gods, and that wasn't their want, but rather something the divine wished and passed through them. Something that falls into that category of the pharaohic law against offense or disrespect to the sun god. It was considered one of the most awful crimes you could commit, and that's pretty difficult because Egypt didn't really have much crime thanks to their efficient baboon police force. If you vandalized or robbed a temple, committed any form of personal disrespect, or were otherwise found guilty of any offense related to the sun god, you were usually sentenced to be burned alive, usually accompanied by a ritual that sacrificed the individual to the god. While the ancient Egyptians rarely practiced actual human sacrifices, this was one of the few exceptions. While burning alive is painful enough to begin with, it was considered the most horrific death of all by ancient Egyptians because of that ritual significance. They believed strongly in preserving the physical body for life after death, and believed that destroying the person's physical body completely by burning would leave them with no vessel in the afterlife, left to drift listlessly. While the gods could still technically intervene to help this person should they feel they deserve it, it was about as terrifying as a punishment as a believer in ancient Egyptian society could imagine. Disturbing decision number 9 is boys in the breeze. Sesostris gets to be remembered for two things. He was one of the greatest military commanders in Egyptian history, and he put up giant hoo-haws and wee-wees everywhere he went. Thankfully, these two feats of his went hand in hand, as he would send warships and troops to every corner of the known world and stretch the kingdom further than anyone else ever had. After each battle, he would commemorate his success by setting up a big pillar with a picture of someone's bits on it. You can literally trace a map of this dude's conquest via dongs on paper. Herodotus saw some of Sesostris' monuments firsthand. For the most part, these pubic pillars were engraved with the usual self-glory crap. Who he was, how he had subdued his enemies, and how certain he was that the gods were in his favor of his invade everyone policy. But guys, that's not all. The type of pubic pillar you received, male versus female, was a battle review system. Forget Google reviews and TripAdvisor ratings. Leaving a ladies versus man's pubic pillar would define if the opposing army had fought valiantly or like a bunch of sissies. 1500 years after they're erected, they still stood in Syria, engraved with the genitals of failure. Disturbing decision number 8 is the ram blood bevy. Psatik III was the last pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, having a pitiful 6-month run before a full-scale Persian invasion rolled into town led by King Cambyses II. A few days after his coronation, rain fell at Thebes, which was a rare event that frightened some Egyptians, who interpreted this as a bad omen and were already dubious of the young, inexperienced king. They were right to be. Sadly, was easily defeated at the Battle of Pisidium due to how little time he'd been on the throne and how unprepared Egypt was for this invasion. That, and he was betrayed by one of his allies. So he fled to Memphis with his army, who'd lost all hope in their pharaoh, and watch as he is captured. His stupid ass is carried back to Egypt in chains when he should have just stayed on the throne and accepted his fate in the first place. Herodotus writes how all his daughters and wives were taken captives, his wife slain, his noblemen sentenced to death. Cambyses brought all of them before the deposed pharaoh to try and elicit a reaction, a weakness. But only when the pharaoh is shown an old friend of his turned into a homeless beggar does he actually become upset and break. The unusual compassion actually spared the pharaoh death, who Cambyses kept in his court for consultation. You'd think he'd appreciate that, since that literally never happens in history. But Psatik tries to raise a rebellion and it fails miserably. With a death sentence imminent, the former pharaoh decides to take his life, not by any traditional, normal, painless method. No. This guy chugs down a vat of ram's blood, a literal vat, then promptly died. Disturbing decision number 7 is excessive children. If you know anything about anyone in Egypt, you already know this is about Ramesses' ancient ass, and I say that not because he lived in ancient times, but because this is the king who somehow lived to 96 in ancient Egypt and still only died because someone ripped a hole in his jugular like they're opening a bag of Doritos. Ramesses enjoyed his time alive, right up until the very end. He built more statues and monuments than any other king of Egypt, and he slept with more women than anyone too. Maybe more than any human being ever. Someone has to have that title out there. If I had to guess based on who exists in documented history, he's taking the cake. Pun intended. The dude had a bare minimum of 100 guaranteed children. guaranteed. If he has that many confirmed, there was definitely a lot more unconfirmed. Gets crazier when I mention he had some of these children with his own children. This was ancient Egypt after all. Gotta keep that royal bloodline pure by making their blood thick as mud, you know? He married at least 3 of his own kids, including his firstborn. He may or may not have married 4. Historians aren't sure whether his wife Huttamire was his daughter or his sister, but since this is Ramesses that we're talking about, there's no reason that daughter, sister, and wife have to be mutually exclusive. Ramses had over 200 wives in his lifetime and pretty much outlived all of them. Disturbing decision number 6 is bring the squad, another law made to serve Egyptian pharaoh's own interests while simultaneously screwing over everyone in the general vicinity, and believe me, there was a few of those, was a law surrounding these servant contracts. See, royals and nobilities in the Old Kingdom had super fun clause written into their hieroglyphic employee contracts in the fine print, stating that when they drop dead, the whole staff is coming with them, dead or alive, take your pick. A dead king needed his squad to support him in the afterlife. On the practical side, you couldn't leave anyone behind who might cause trouble for the new king. It made for a mass display of power, as these weren't just lowly servants being tossed down there. When the practice started, it was people of incredibly high rank and tremendous value to Egyptian state. This went to instill the lower class with tremendous awe and respect for these early kings. What better way to show off your power than to throw away your wealth? What's more valuable than your whole family? In a recent vid, the top 10 repulsive queens from ancient Egypt you never learned about, I mentioned how Lady Pharaoh Merneith is buried with 50 of her servants. All of them were alive when interred. Almost 600 victims are found buried with King Djerer, and King Ahab had 41 courtiers, retainers, and others who downed poison and were buried with him. Egyptian royalty stopped this practice in the early First Dynasty, but it continued in more innocent form. Yushabati, the little carved figurines that can magically serve the deceased in the afterlife. Disturbing decision number 5 is the piss fetish. Zarathustra, the pubic pillar guy, had a son named Pharaohs who had gone blind at a young age. Now this was likely some kind of disease, or family genetic, or maybe even the result of an infection, or the result of pissing off the gods. See, the legend says Pharaohs was fed up with the Nile flooding and it refusing to listen to his decree to stop flooding. It's a fucking river, what are you thinking? So the dummy tossed a spear at it in frustration, I don't know, rampant stupidity maybe, assuming that would work, and for said stupidity and insolence, he was allegedly struck blind by the gods. 10 years go by, and an oracle happens to roll through Egypt with a message for the blind pharaoh that he could get his sight back. All he had to do, she told him, was wash his eyes with the urine of a woman who had never slept with anyone other than her husband. Off Pharaohs went, no questions asked, such as what temperature it needed to be. If dark yellow or clear is better, you know, the fixins. He immediately finds his wife and either hands her a bucket or takes a knee because somehow that piss got in the man's eyes as the prophet requested. Yet nothing happened. Pharaohs was still blind, and now his wife has some explaining to do. First though, Pharaohs was very focused on not being blind, so he had the army round up every married woman in town. Everyone's given a bucket, or like said, the king took a knee. History does not preserve the piss to eyes transportation method. Finally, after being peed on by an undisclosed amount of women, Pharaohs saw the light thanks to the one woman in all of Egypt who hadn't cheated on her husband, which Pharaohs immediately changed by having her divorce her husband and become his new wife on the spot. Then together, they burnt his last wife at the stake and lived happily ever after. Disturbing decision number 4 is Heb Sed. Back in ancient Egypt, things weren't quite so simple because apparently a pharaoh who had ruled for 30 years also needed to perform a minor Olympics by themselves. Egyptians observed a strange ritual called Heb Sed, which culminated in the pharaoh running around a racetrack in the courtyard of their palace wearing a kilt with an animal's tail attached to it. And woe betide anyone who didn't complete the course. It became one of the oldest and longest running rituals of Egyptian history, having existed for 5,000 years. It usually took place on the 4th month of the Egyptian calendar, so it coincided with the Nile flooding. The pharaoh would make numerous offerings to the gods and having a lavish recrowning ceremony. Some occasions concluded with the pharaoh being given a ceremonial bow and arrow he'd shoot towards the 4 corners of the kingdom just to show how far-reaching their power was. Once a pharaoh had celebrated their first Heb Sed, they had to repeat the ceremony every 3 years until their death. The main event had the pharaoh, as said, dressed in a short kilt with the tail of a bull or some similar creature attached to the back and placed placed on a running track in front of an audience of dignitaries where they'd be made to run as quickly as possible around the track. Besides simply giving the pharaoh a chance to demonstrate their vigor and athleticism, Egyptologists are unclear precisely what the point of the pharaoh's bizarre foot race really was. Some have suggested it was purely ceremonial and represented the pharaoh outrunning old age. Others claim that it was intended like the bow and arrow to represent the pharaoh reaching all parts of their kingdom. Others have claimed that there was much more practical reason for it. If the pharaoh wasn't able to complete the course, then they were no longer fit to rule, and they would be promptly sacrificed to make way for their younger, fitter successor. Disturbing decision number 3 is to let the priests punish. There was a time period where the power of the pharaoh slipped away into the hands of the priests, who puppeteered young and inexperienced throne heirs into dumb decisions and handing over too much power. Priests' influence and power over the common people increased continually over the years, and before long they were being consulted for far more than they had ever been before. Those in power knew better than to question the priests too much, as they were considered able to contact and gain support of the gods. Thus, it would be like questioning the gods, which, as you know from point 1, is a big ol' no-no. This power would also be able to potentially influence large amounts of people to do their bidding. So naturally, in the latter days of ancient Egypt, the priesthood now found itself involved in matters of court. They would bring in a statue of the sun god and set papyri before it with different options for important decisions. In court, they were genuinely 2 papers deciding innocent or guilt. The statue was supposed to turn towards whichever the correct paper was, showing the will of the gods. Of course, this gave the priests a chance to manipulate the statue's movements and essentially decide the court cases based on their own opinions, biases, and whims. Disturbing decision number 2 is river seedlings, aka how the pharaoh would whip it out in front of the entire kingdom once a year and yank his proverbial chain until completion into the Nile. This came from the story of how Ra created the earth through the act of sacred self-pleasure, something that the Egyptians glorified and saw as an act connecting oneself with the gods, their own spiritual essence, and their physical being. And they're not wrong. It's an incredibly healthy approach to viewing self-pleasure. The ancient world, especially ancient Egypt, was obsessed with growth, birth, creation, and that which gave life, with many myths and legends springing up in and around the concept of fertility. The Nile was also revered for life-giving qualities, so it should come as no surprise that the ceremonial spilling of seed during an annual festival devoted to it, Ra and the life, would occur. The symbolism here is pretty powerful when we consider the fact that the ancients viewed time in a circular format rather than a linear succession of moments. In fact, the ancient Egyptian word for seed, progeny, and describing the floods of the Nile was all the same word, MTWT. No idea how to pronounce it, not gonna try. The ancient Egyptians knew life-giving, fertilizing ways of the predictable floods of the Nile, and they saw the same properties in seed. So, after your pharaoh had finished his duty by the Nile, the noblemen would take their turn as a group, followed by all the men of Egypt being invited to spill their seed in the river of life as well. Call it community bonding. Disturbing decision number 1 is the daughter deal. Khufu, the son of Snefru, decided to one-up his old man when he commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the last standing 7 wonders of the ancient world. Even though there's still much left to speculation, there's a few things we do know for certain about the Great Pyramids, such as the fact they are oversized tombs dedicated to the pharaoh's ego. They were originally covered in white limestone and gold. They were never used for grain storage. It took Khufu about 20 years to have his built, and he sold his daughter as a pleasure worker in the process. Let's pause on that last one real quick. Yeah, so Khufu didn't really have the funds to spend on a pyramid of this size and grandeur, but he was determined to beat out his daddy. Herodotus, the OG history recorder of Egypt, makes more than one mention of it, and usually with a lot of attitude, because even he thought it was a little rank and Herodotus had seen some shit. To quote, Khufu descended to such a degree of infamy that he sold his own daughter in a brothel and ordered her to exact, they do not say how much, but she exacted a certain amount of money, as much as her father had ordered her to. Like in ancient Babylon, ancient Egypt at least saw being a working girl as a divine and respectable act done for the gods. So it wasn't like everyone in the kingdom, including Khufu, went on to destroy this poor girl's life. Rather deemed what she did an honorable and godly service. But still, pretty effed up that her dad would blow all his money on a project to the point he asked his own daughter to hit the streets. You're the pharaoh, this is your project, and this is free love ancient Egypt, baby, so why don't you go get your own bag? Thank you once again for tuning into Bumblebee. I hope you enjoyed. Take some time to subscribe to the Hive to see more of our videos, and drop a like and some comments below. I'll see you next time.